They thought Barron Trump was just a privileged kid born into luxury and power. A young man raised in the spotlight, protected by his father's name, former President Donald Trump. To them, Barron was nothing more than a symbol of inherited status. So when he appeared in a courtroom in Los Angeles, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit with a calm, composed look on his face, no one took him seriously. In fact, many were there just to witness a public embarrassment. The courtroom was packed. Rows of lawyers, journalists, and curious spectators filled the gallery. Cameras clicked, pens scratched across notepads. People murmured quietly, expecting a simple, uneventful hearing, one that would show a teenager trying and failing to play in a world far beyond his depth. At the center of it all was Judge Ronald Beckett, a man known for his sharp wit and his no-nonsense approach to justice. He had little patience for what he saw as theatrics, especially from high-profile individuals who assumed the rules didn't apply to them. He looked at the 18-year-old standing before him and leaned back in his chair, tapping the gavel slowly on his desk. His gaze scanned the young man, studying the perfectly pressed suit, the flawless posture, like someone trying to play a part. Judge Beckett let out a sigh and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Trump," he began, his tone dry and almost amused, "I must say, this is a first for me. An 18-year-old standing in my courtroom expecting to argue a case. Now, I understand your last name might open certain doors, but this courtroom isn't one of them." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Even some of the lawyers exchanged smirks, confident that this boy was in way over his head. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood still, hands folded in front of him, his eyes locked on the judge. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, no signs of hesitation. Judge Beckett raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to say? No speech prepared? I expected at least a half-hearted attempt at proving you belong here." More laughter. Someone in the back whispered, "He's out of his league." Finally, Barron spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm and steady. "I wasn't aware the purpose of this courtroom was entertainment, Your Honor." The laughter stopped instantly. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. The judge's smirk faded slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to feel the shift in the room. He flipped through the case file in front of him again. "Well," Beckett muttered, "let's hope you can back up that confidence with something more than just your last name." The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. The tension was still there, but now it came with curiosity. What had seemed like a formality was starting to look like something far more interesting. And no one, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even the spectators, was prepared for what would happen next. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted the moment Barron Trump answered the judge. That one calm, cutting response had silenced the laughter and erased the smug grins. What had begun as a spectacle was quickly becoming something more serious. The boy they had come to mock was now someone they couldn't stop watching. Judge Ronald Beckett, sitting high above the courtroom, adjusted his glasses and tapped his pen lightly on the desk. His expression, once full of dry amusement, had become more focused, more curious. In all his years on the bench, he had seen all types of litigators. The cocky, overconfident types, the seasoned pros, the ones who relied on charm, and the ones who thought money could substitute for merit. But never an 18-year-old standing completely alone. After a brief silence, Judge Beckett leaned forward and spoke again, his tone still reserved but no longer mocking. "All right then. If you believe you deserve to be heard, prove it. Let's begin." You could have heard a pin drop. Barron stepped forward with measured calm and placed a neatly organized stack of documents on the podium. He opened his brief and adjusted the microphone without hesitation, like he had done it 100 times before. "Before we begin," he said clearly, "I'd like to address a few legal misinterpretations that have already been introduced in this case." The audience, which had been filled with whispers and rustling moments ago, fell silent again. Barron continued, steady and precise. "The opposing counsel has repeatedly cited Harper versus Sullivan as a precedent for dismissing key testimony in this case. However, that ruling was based on improperly obtained evidence under unconstitutional search conditions, circumstances that do not apply here. Therefore, the citation is irrelevant." On the other side of the courtroom, the lead attorney, a veteran litigator in his 50s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at his notes, quickly flipping through them. Judge Beckett raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" he asked. Barron nodded, flipping to the next page in his legal brief. "Yes, Your Honor. In fact, if we were discussing admissibility, Foster versus Crane would be a more appropriate precedent. That case specifically deals with testimonial credibility under conditions of indirect coercion, which is far more relevant to today's arguments." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. Legal experts exchanged glances. Some of the most skeptical faces began to look impressed. This wasn't a child parroting legal terms. This was someone who had done his homework, someone with precision and clarity. Judge Beckett leaned forward, the smirk now completely gone. This was no longer a formality. This was a real argument, a real challenge. And the most surprising part? It wasn't coming from a seasoned attorney, but from a teenager the court had never taken seriously until now. Each word Barron Trump spoke seemed to push back the assumptions surrounding him. The courtroom, once buzzing with quiet mockery, was now utterly still. His opponent, a seasoned attorney representing the plaintiff, could feel the pressure building. This wasn't the performance they had expected from an 18-year-old with no law degree and no courtroom experience. The veteran lawyer straightened his tie, trying to reassert control. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "we're not here for a law school debate. While Mr. Trump's references may sound impressive, they remain theoretical. The matter at hand is far more practical than what he's presenting." Before the judge could respond, Barron calmly turned his head, his voice clear and composed. "If the opposing side is dismissing precedent simply because it's inconvenient for their case, that only highlights the weakness of their argument, not mine." A hush fell over the room again. A few in the gallery stifled chuckles, not mocking ones this time, but reactions to the sheer audacity and accuracy of what had just been said. The balance in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Judge Beckett tapped his pen lightly on the bench and turned to the veteran attorney. "Would you like to respond to that?" The attorney hesitated. He glanced at his notes, flipped a few pages, then responded stiffly. "I'll address it in my argument, Your Honor." But the damage was done. The hesitation was obvious. The confidence had cracked. Barron, still poised, adjusted his documents and waited quietly. This time, when Judge Beckett spoke, his tone was no longer condescending. It was attentive. "Continue, Mr. Trump." This wasn't just about allowing the young man to speak anymore. Now, the court, including the judge, truly wanted to hear what he had to say. Barron pressed on, dissecting the opposition's argument with clarity. While the opposing counsel's attempt to discredit Foster versus Crane is noted, Barron said, it's important to understand the full scope of that case. The ruling did not solely address coercion. It reinforced that testimony remains admissible when the primary conditions of influence are absent. He held up a marked page from his brief. This is exactly why the witness in this case remains legally protected. Judge Beckett raised his eyebrows slightly. He glanced at the opposing attorney, waiting for a rebuttal. But there was none. Another wave of murmurs moved through the gallery. Reporters typed faster. Legal analysts whispered among themselves. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't bravado. It was precision. Barron continued, his voice steady. The idea that testimony should be dismissed simply because it's inconvenient to the opposing side is not only legally incorrect, it's dangerous. Selectively applying precedent undermines the foundation of due process. The courtroom remained silent. Then Judge Beckett exhaled, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. It was something else, realization. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced, and studied the young man in front of him. "Well, Mr. Trump," he said, "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that." From the moment Barron Trump first spoke, he had begun to shift the momentum of the courtroom. But now, he had taken full control. He was no longer reacting to the situation. He was driving it. With every page he turned, every citation he made, he wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling the opposing side piece by piece. The plaintiff's attorney, clearly rattled, attempted to strike back. He stood tall, his voice firm but slightly strained. "Your Honor, While Mr. Trump's reference to Foster versus Crane is certainly eloquent, it carries little weight in this context. That case dealt with testimonial coercion, not the chain of evidence. Barron didn't hesitate. He turned another page in his notes and replied, calmly but directly, "Counsel is mistaken. The ruling in Foster addressed more than coercion. It explicitly reinforced that testimony remains admissible if the primary conditions of influence do not exist. That's precisely why the witness in this case is legally protected." He held up the relevant passage for emphasis, letting the words speak for themselves. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Even among seasoned legal experts in the gallery, there were nods of quiet recognition. This wasn't rehearsed bluffing or flashy language. This was real legal reasoning, accurate, sharp, and confidently delivered. Judge Beckett leaned forward slightly, studying Barron more intently now. This wasn't what he had anticipated, not from someone so young. On the other side of the courtroom, the opposing attorney took a breath and tried again. "Your Honor, we are veering off track. Regardless of Mr. Trump's interpretation, we are still dealing with issues surrounding procedural error." Barron, composed as ever, responded without missing a beat. "If the law is inconvenient for your argument, that's not my fault." A single laugh escaped from somewhere in the back of the room, quickly stifled. But the tone in the courtroom had changed. Barron wasn't just holding his ground anymore. He was pressing forward, forcing the opposing counsel onto the defensive with each exchange. Judge Beckett exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "All right, Mr. Trump, keep going." The courtroom leaned in, collectively hanging on what Barron would say next. He flipped to a new page, eyes scanning with precision. "The plaintiff's entire claim rests on a misapplication of Keating versus Burlington," he said plainly. Instantly, murmurs spread among the attorneys seated behind the opposing counsel. The lead attorney stiffened. "That case has been cited many times to exclude evidence due to procedural error," he said defensively. Barron nodded. "Correct. But if you actually read the decision, rather than cherry-pick from it, you'd recall that the ruling specified that procedural errors must directly affect the reliability of the evidence. In this case, that standard has not been met. The law is being used here not to clarify the truth, but to shield the argument from it." Judge Beckett blinked, pausing slightly. The opposing attorney tensed, flipping through his notes, and then closing the folder altogether. Barron continued, now with complete authority. "If we allow that logic to stand, we create a loophole where minor technicalities outweigh the pursuit of substantive justice. That's not how precedent works, and I trust this court knows that." Silence. Then the judge, almost to himself, muttered, "That's an interesting perspective." But what everyone in that courtroom understood, even if no one dared to say it out loud, was this. Barron Trump wasn't there to play lawyer. He was there to win. By now, Barron Trump was no longer just being tolerated in the courtroom. He was commanding it. The same people who had laughed at his presence just hours ago were now watching in stunned silence as he continued to strip the opposing argument down to its bare bones. The seasoned attorney across the aisle had closed his folder, a subtle but clear sign. He had nothing left to counter with. The citations Barron had used were accurate. His interpretations were sharp. And more importantly, he hadn't missed a single step. Judge Ronald Beckett, who had spent decades behind that bench, finally leaned forward and tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence the room, but simply to acknowledge the weight of what had just taken place. He looked at Barron, fingers laced, and said with measured tone, "Do you realize what you've just done?" Barron met his gaze, unwavering. "I've presented the only legally consistent conclusion, Your Honor." The judge exhaled through his nose, not in disbelief, not in irritation, but in realization. This young man had come into his courtroom, completely underestimated, and had turned the tide of the entire hearing. Beckett sat back and addressed the opposing counsel. "Counselor, do you have anything further to add in response?" The lawyer stood stiffly. His jaw was tight. Everyone could see it. He had no rebuttal that wouldn't make him look weaker. After a pause, he answered, "No further objections, Your Honor." A wave of whispers moved through the gallery. Barron Trump, The teenager they had dismissed just hours earlier had forced a veteran legal team to retreat. Not with tricks, not with privilege, but with substance. The judge tapped the gavel twice, his voice calm and decisive. In that case, the testimony will remain admissible. The tension that had built up in the courtroom finally broke. There were gasps, exchanged glances, and even a reporter near the front whispered under her breath, "Unbelievable." Barron exhaled slowly, not in relief, but as someone who had known this would be the outcome from the very beginning. He didn't smile. He didn't grandstand. He simply began gathering his notes. Judge Beckett watched him carefully. The skepticism he had shown earlier was completely gone, replaced by something else, something rarely seen in his courtroom: respect. But he wasn't done yet. Beckett straightened his chair, his voice steady but deliberate. "I've been on this bench for a long time," he said, "and I've seen plenty of people walk through those doors thinking they can outsmart the law. Most of them fail." The room leaned in. Everyone was listening. "But you," the judge continued, pointing slightly with his pen, "you didn't rely on theatrics. You didn't stall. You didn't throw around legal jargon just to sound clever. You knew exactly what you were doing." Barron remained still, composed, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He hadn't expected the compliment. Not from this judge. Beckett tilted his head. "Tell me something, son. How long have you been studying law?" Barron answered without pause. "For years, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And yet you're not in law school?" A beat of silence. "Not yet," Barron replied with quiet certainty. Beckett let out a short breath, almost a chuckle, and shook his head. "I'll say this. If the attorneys in my courtroom came in with half the preparation you've shown today, my job would be a lot easier." Across the room, the opposing legal team sat frozen, arms crossed, saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Beckett adjusted his glasses and looked one last time at Barron. "The testimony remains admissible. That ruling is final." Then, with a firm strike of the gavel, "Court is adjourned." Barron gathered his notes, gave the judge a polite nod, and walked out of the courtroom. Everyone watched him, not as the son of a former president, but as something very different, a force to be reckoned with. Barron Trump stepped out of the courtroom into the fading afternoon sun of Los Angeles. No bodyguards surrounding him, no flashing lights, no press swarming him. But one thing was undeniable: everyone was watching. Not out of curiosity anymore, not out of doubt, but out of quiet respect. Inside that courtroom, they had expected a boy with a famous name to make a fool of himself. Instead, they witnessed something they'd never forget: an 18-year-old who stood alone against seasoned attorneys, a skeptical judge, and a gallery full of doubters, and left them speechless. He didn't win with status. He didn't win with power. He won with preparation, precision, and poise. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a victory against assumption, against mockery, against every voice that said, "You don't belong here." Judge Beckett, the man who had welcomed Barron into the courtroom with a smirk, had dismissed him at first. But by the end, that smirk had turned into something else entirely: admiration. The opposing counsel, who had viewed the hearing as a formality, walked out silent, unable to refute what had just happened. And the reporters who had arrived, expecting a headline about failure, now had to write about an unexpected phenomenon. Barron didn't give a speech afterward. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't bask in applause. He didn't need to, because when someone walks into a room full of people expecting them to fail and leaves with every eye watching in awe, their actions speak louder than any headline. And the lesson? Never underestimate someone because of their age, their background, or their name. Some people walk into a room with the weight of everyone's doubt pressing on their shoulders and walk out carrying everyone's respect instead. It's not power that defines a person. It's not wealth. It's not fame. It's preparation. It's knowledge. And it's the courage to stand up and speak, even when no one expects you to. If you're someone out there who's been told you're too young, too inexperienced, or that you're only where you are because of who your parents are, remember this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to know what you're talking about and speak with conviction. The world will listen. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are more stories like this out there. and you won't want to miss what's coming next.